And the remaining modules what we have? Spring, JDBC, Spring ORM, and we have Spring AOP, and we have MVC, and we have to discuss services like transactions, security, JMS, and timer services, quad services, and here mailing services. Under services we have to discuss all these services here. Okay, so now you can understand JDBC, ORM independently. You can understand anything. Okay, so we know IOC, right? On top of IOC you can execute any framework. You can test the services, or else you can go through MVC or JDBC, anything you can understand. So just I'll go through MVC. Okay, actual MVC definition: model view controller. So model view controller framework, the given model view controller framework, it need to support up to model part, right? So this model view controller framework will provide us support from presentation part to model part. From presentation to model part, here it will help us. View, controller, and model. So for model, we required business classes here. We required business classes here, DO classes here, and some services classes. So here for business classes we can go through simple POSO classes. DO classes also we can go through simple POSO classes, and for services also we can use simple POSOs. Okay, and for controller also we can use simple POSO classes. So here what we required to execute all these classes, we required a IOC container. We required a IOC container. On top of IOC you can execute this business POSO classes, and you can execute this DO POSOs, and you can execute service POSO classes. Finally you can execute controller POSOs also here. So by using this MVC framework, by using Spring MVC, up to what you can provide support. By using this Spring MVC, in this MVC architecture, up to what we can provide support. In this Spring MVC, the given features, we have features: form backup support, form backup support, form backup support. Form backup support, it is useful for presentation part. So one form backup support they given for presentation part. By using this form backup support, what we can do? We can hold data into bean classes. Whenever you try to submit form, that form data we can hold into bean classes. We can hold form data into bean classes, and we can apply validations. In case if you find any validation errors, along with returning validation errors, previous bean properties also you can populate into same form. Let's say if you have properties ID, name, email, mobile. If you enter a valid ID and a valid name and a valid email, and if you enter any invalid mobile number, in this case, if you want to do server side validations, we need to submit this data. Whenever you submit this data, that data actually framework need to store under bean, and it need to execute validations. After completion of validations, validation errors it need to print here. Means here mobile number not valid. A message it need to display here. Along with displaying this message, it need to delete the existing mobile number value, and previous form data, valid fields data, it need to maintain as it is here. Valid fields data we have to maintain as it is here. So that is what actually form backup support. So that form backup support they are providing here. But to achieve this form backup support, for presentation part we have to go through Spring tags. We have to use Spring tag libraries. In struts also we have the support, right? So there we have to use struts tag library. Here we have to use Spring tag library. By using Spring tags we have to create presentation part. And here they are providing controller support. Controllers, multi-action controllers, and multi-form controllers. Here they are providing support, multi-action controllers, multi-form controller support. So by using this multi-action and multiple form controllers, what we can do? In case if we have multiple input forms, like one student registration, employee registration, and some login. Okay, yeah. Student registration or student updation, student find operations. If you want to do student registration, student update operation, and student find operation. All these three operations, if you want to execute from only one single controller class, you can write a single controller. From that controller you can write registration, and here you can write update method, and here you can write some find method. And for each event, for each button call, you can execute your required methods from one single controller. You can write one single student controller. In that controller you can handle multiple forms you can handle from one single controller. So that multi-action controllers we have. In case if we have Aadhaar registration kind of things, Aadhaar registration, Aadhaar form 1, Aadhaar form 2, Aadhaar form 3, multiple form handling if you have. In case in one single operation, for one single use case, if you have three forms, these three forms data if you want to handle by using one single controller also you can handle. That type of controllers also they given here. Multi-action controllers and multiple form controllers also we have. In case of servlets, actually, in case of this multi-form, what we used to do, we have to read data and we have to store into session object. Then again we have to forward next page. This page data also again we have to keep it into session. On final page submission, we have to read previous two forms data from session and final data from request. Finally we need to persist it. When in case of servlets, in struts we have one support, validator action form support. By using that validator action form, you can store multiple forms data into one single bean. Finally we can process it. So the same type of action classes they given here. By using that action classes, you can handle validations and as well as multiple form support also here. So that multi-form controllers here they given and multi-action controllers they given. And here it is providing validation support. Validation support here they given. And they are providing here internationalization support. I-89 support also we have here. Internationalization support, and here we have interceptors also they given here. Interceptor support, interceptors, and they given one concept here, view resolvers also they given here. Somewhat new concept in Spring. So this form backup controllers, validations, I-89, exception handling, all this we have. Exception handling also they given. The same features we have in struts 1x also, right? In struts 1x we have, in struts 2x also we have. The same type of features here they given. Exception handling support. By default modularization support we have here. Modularization support by default they given here. So you can achieve all these features by using Spring MVC. So all these features will help us up to which part? From presentation part to only controller part. Then what about model? Here internally we should use to execute this MVC classes, we have to use internally IOC container only. So if you are going through IOC container, in that IOC container we can execute model layer classes also. So you can use, here you can use MVC for complete MVC application. Okay, so if you have any business classes or services classes, that business and services classes also you can execute on MVC IOC container. For MVC, which IOC container it is using here? For MVC, that container name is web application context. By using this web application context container, you can execute your controllers and the remaining model layer classes also. But MVC framework will provide us support from presentation part to controller part. So the remaining beans you can write, you can execute, it will support. So by using MVC, you can provide support up to controller. The remaining model layer classes also we can execute on that MVC IOC container. Getting? By using MVC, you can provide support from presentation to controller only. The remaining model layer classes are simple poses only, right? Model layer classes, business classes and DAO classes and your services classes. So this POSO classes you can execute on this web application context container also. It is similar like your application context container. Okay, so you can execute model layer classes also on this web application context container along with your controller classes. And this MVCs, actually to design MVC frameworks, to design this MVC framework, the recommended models are what? By following which models they need to design? To design MVC frameworks, for designing MVC frameworks, for designing MVC frameworks, the recommended models are, the recommended architecture models are JSP model architectures. By following JSP model architecture rules, actually this MVC framework vendors, they will design MVC frameworks. So we know struts, right? We know struts 1x and struts 2x, JSF, and the next coming one MVC. So these all frameworks, by using this JSP model architectures only they designed. So as per JSP model architecture, how your application should be? As per JSP model architectures, there are actually 4 JSP models, right? JSP model 1 architecture, model 2 architecture, model 3, model 4. So as per JSP model architectures, multiple views request we need to handle by using only one single controller. Multiple views request, multiple input pages request, multiple inputs request we have to handle by using one single controller. And this controller, what it need to execute? This controller need to execute common required operations for this multiple input pages. One input page operation and the next input page operations may be different, but some common things we may need to execute. Common things are like validations. So if it is student registration form, student registration, if it is some employee registration, and if it is some login form. So for these 3 forms, common operation, if you have anything, if you have any common operations for these 3 forms, for student registration, for employee registration, and for login form, if you have any common operation, that common set of operations we need to execute from this controller. And after execution of, like let's say if you want to validate it, if you want to execute validations for this form, validations if you required for this form and for this form and for this form. This required validations you can write here. For these 3 forms, required validations you just write here. And for these 3 forms, common required operations from controller, 3 forms data we have to read. By using request.get parameter, request.get parameter, like by using that single line statement, request dot get parameter. We have to pass that particular IDs and we need to get values here. So to read this 3 forms data again and again, you have to write the same code, request dot get parameter. Instead of writing that code here, if you have any customization here, read data, to read data. After reading data, actually these controllers, they used to hold the data into beans. So here for student registration, we need to write one student registration bean, and for employee registration bean, and for logging bean. After reading data, they used to hold into bean objects. So from these beans we can collect our required data. So common operations, required validations, and one more common required operation, read data. And if you have any common set of operations, that all operations you can write from this single controller. And after execution of your common set of operations, then specific operations it need to execute. For student registration operation. For employee registration. And for login operations need to execute. So for that specific operations, we need to execute some helper classes, helper controllers. So for student registration, one helper controller, and right, for employee registration, one employee registration controller, and for login we have to write one login controller. So instead of executing the same validations code and reading data code again and again here, you can execute that you can execute that common operations from this controller, and the remaining specific operations you can write here, so that you don't need to write the same code again and again in all these controllers. Okay, in case of 3 controllers, you can reduce 3 times this validation code and form data reading code. In case if you have 1000 forms for your application, that 1000 forms code we can reduce, right, 1000 times. You don't need to apply validations and form data read operations. Just you can get this bean object. If it is student registration, you can get this bean object here, you can get this bean object here, you can get this bean object here, and finally you can send it to your required model operations. Just here you don't need to write much code, just get that bean, send it to model part. You don't need to write validations or form data read operations again and again here, right? If I execute that same operations here, then I don't need to write that same validations again and again here. So as per JSP model architecture, common required operations we have to write under one single controller. You can call that controllers like front controllers. Front controller. You need to write common required operations under front controller. You need to write common required operations under front controller. If that front controller, if it is JSP, as a controller we can go through JSPs, right? Under controller part we can write JSPs. So if it is JSP, if you are using JSP here, if your front controller, if it is JSP, then that architecture name is JSP model 1 architecture. JSP model 1. Front controller, if you use front controller classes, if the front controller, if it is JSP, then you can call that model as JSP model 1. If your front controller, if it is servlet, you can call it as JSP model 2. And you can use here filters also. If you go through filter, then you can call JSP model 3. Finally you can take here tag support also. If you go through tag support, you can call that model as JSP model 4. And in these JSP models, the recommended models are servlet and filters. Servlets and filters are recommended here. So here servlet JSP model 2 is recommended model, and filter JSP model 3 also recommended JSP models. Okay, why these two recommended and what about these two? If it is JSP model 1, as a controller we have to use JSP page. Coming to JSP model 4, to use tags we have to use again a JSP page. If it is a JSP page is not secured, right? So they can do any manipulations. If I write this common set of operations under JSPs, there is a chance to do the manipulation changes. But if you go through servlet or filter, we used to provide data in the form of dot class files, right? So we can protect our common set of operations. If you write through servlets or filters, we can hide that code, right? So here the recommended two models are JSP model 2 and JSP model 3 architectures. So by using JSP model 2 and JSP model 3 architectures, we have many frameworks. By using JSP model 2 architecture, Apache people designed Struts 1x. Struts 1x MVC framework designed by using JSP model 2. And the same Apache people, they designed one more framework, Struts 2. Struts 2x. Struts 2 framework, it's a type of JSP model 3 architecture framework. JSP model 3 architecture. And by using the same JSP model 2, Spring people, they designed Spring MVC. Spring MVC, it's a type of JSP model 2 architecture framework.